Thanks again. Good morning, young people. Our subject was supposed to be Elijah the prophet today, but we haven't finished the previous study. So I want you to come to Habakkuk chapter 3. We're going to finish off some of these things before we move into Elijah the prophet. Now, while you're doing that, looking up Habakkuk chapter 3, I'm going to summarise what we learned in our session yesterday when we looked at Deuteronomy 33 verse 2, Psalm 68 verses 1 to 4 and verse 17, and Habakkuk chapter 3 verses 3 to 5. This is what we learned. This is what Moses, David and Habakkuk saw of the path taken by Yahweh Sabaoth from Sinai into the sanctuary. Of course, there's a couple of diversions, as you would have seen yesterday. A couple of diversions were the work amongst the Arabs. So when Christ and the saints depart from Sinai, their first work is a work amongst the Arab peoples to the south and east of the land of Israel. Then they have a work amongst the Egyptians. We're going to see the reason for that here this morning. And then they proceed on their way through the deserts, as we read in Psalm 68, riding through the deserts to come in like the rising sun upon the sanctuary. Of course, it will be at this time under the heel of the Gogian Confederacy. There will be a small surviving remnant of Jews holding out in the old city of Jerusalem, and Christ and the saints will arrive at that moment and destroy the Gogian Confederacy with a great earthquake. And of course we know what that will do. It will trigger off around the world huge earthquakes and tsunamis, which will bring the infrastructure of this world into ruin. More about that perhaps a bit later on. So that was the journey we took in those three passages. Now here in Habakkuk chapter 3, we got down to verse 7 and we were talking about the tents of Cushan and the curtains of the land of Midian. Just testing you out. What do you think it means when it says tents and curtains? Yeah, nomadic peoples. You don't live in tents, do you? Unless you're at Manitoulin or something like that. So tents are a nomadic people. It's talking about Arab peoples. That's why we can identify the Cushan here as the Arabs of the Sinai region, lining them up with the daughter of Jethro, Zipporah, who's called a Cushite in Numbers 12 verse 1. And of course even Jethro himself is called the priest of Midian. So this is the region in which he lived. So here we have the peoples who live in and around the region of Sinai. That's where the saints will be judged. That's where they will be prepared for their work. From that point they will leave to make their way to Jerusalem. So the peoples immediately around that area will be the first to feel the divine judgments. It says in verse 7, I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction, and the curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. What does that imply to you? It means that these peoples come under the influence of Christ and the saints, because that's what this context is about, the movement of Christ and the saints. So they are affected by the movement of Christ and the saints into this area because they're going to be prepared for something very special. We want to talk about that in a moment. So there's a reason why God has set the order in this way, young people. Nothing that God does is without design. And He's designed this thousands of years ago. So He spoke through Habakkuk, and He speaks through other prophets to tell us exactly what He's going to do, so that you and I can have a clear vision of these things. We don't have to have it muddy and mixed up, as unfortunately it is amongst some. We can have a clear vision of the things that are before us. And the clearer you can make it, the more certain you will be about its fulfillment, and the more equipped you will be to deal with the world that is throwing so much at you as young people today. That's why this is so important for you. Isaiah chapter 21 gives us the next... No, don't go to it. Just while I'm here, I want to show you the second step. The first step of verse 7 is the Arabs. What about verse 8? I'll read this verse to you. Was Yahweh displeased against the rivers? Was thine anger against the rivers? Was thy wrath against the sea, that thou didst ride upon thine horses and thy chariots of salvation? What do you reckon the rivers and the sea are here? What land do you think might be referred to here? A land identified with rivers and a sea which has some historical connection with Israel. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Egypt. Because the Israelites dwelt in the Nile Delta. There were many rivers that came off, branches of the Nile, and came out. That's where Israel dwelt. And when they left Egypt, where do they come? They crossed over the Red Sea. So there's a hint. You've got to read your Bible carefully. You've got to think. God's not just going to give this to you on a platter. You think he's going to do that? If he did that, the whole world would know about it. He only wants us, those who have the secrets, his children. He wants us to know about this. But we've got to think about it. So the rivers and the sea of verse 8 is a reference to Egypt. And that's the second step that Christ and the saints will take. They will go into Egypt to smite and to heal and to begin the work of recovering that people. You say, well, what for? Because Israel is going to pass through there again. That's what's for. Returning under Elijah, they will pass through this land again. Isaiah 11 makes that very clear, as we shall see when we come to the work of Elijah the prophet. So then, now you can turn to Isaiah 21, please. Now here's a couple of clues. I'm going to test you this morning. I'm going to give you a couple of clues and then test you to see whether you've been thinking. Isaiah 21 begins with the words, the burden of the desert of the sea. When was the last time you saw a desert that was a sea? Nobody's seen one. A sea that is a desert. That's how this chapter starts. Well, what does the sea represent in the scriptures? Sea. Nations. How do we know that? Isaiah 17. Jot these down. You want proof of this? Here it is. That the sea is a symbol of nations. Isaiah 17, verses 12 and 13. Isaiah 57, verse 20. Revelation chapter 17, verse 15. Now they're off the top of my head, so I think I'm right. You can check me out. It'll be pretty close. So the sea is symbolic for nations. What's a desert? A desert is a wilderness, isn't it? So we've got a wilderness that is a sea. In other words, this is a wilderness of peoples and nations and tongues. This chapter is going to deal with the wilderness of the peoples. And it's into the wilderness of the peoples that Elijah will bring the Jews when he gathers them from all countries to bring them back to the land of Israel. And the wilderness of the peoples being referred to is Europe, the body of Europe that will be in revolt against Christ after Armageddon. So that's the context of this chapter. Guess what it's about? Head of my Bible it says the fall of Babylon. You have a look at verse 9. And behold, here cometh a chariot of men with a couple of horsemen. And he answered and said, Babylon is fallen, and all the graven images of her gods he hath broken to the ground. O my threshing, and the corn of my floor, that which I have heard of Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, have I declared unto you. The destruction of Babylon begins with Armageddon and ends 40 years later, when the papacy and all the nations of Europe who have been in revolt against Christ will be destroyed. We know this chapter is about the beginning of God's judgments. Oh, my threshing, heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. So when you go down, we've got a hymn based upon verses 11 and 12. The burden of Jumah, he calleth to me out of Seir. Watchman, what of the night? Remember that hymn? That's where it comes from. Then we come to verse 13. In verse 13 we read, the burden upon Arabia. That word burden there means an oracle. It This is a prophecy of God about Arabia. In the forest in Arabia shall ye lodge, O ye travelling companies of Dedanim. So here we are in Isaiah 21 with the oracle on Arabia. And it talks here about travelling companies of Dedanim. Travelling companies. Sounds like nomadic people, doesn't it? Okay. Now Dedanim is a family that can trace its origins back to Abraham and Cush. Somewhere along the line there seems to have been some kind of connection between the family of Abraham and Cush to produce these nomadic peoples who travel around. Now we know what region they're travelling around because this is a prophecy about Arabia. Arabia is over here, okay? This is Arabia scripturally. And it says, verse 14, the inhabitants of the land of Timar. Now Timar was a son of Ishmael, and we find in scripture that he dwelt in this region around here. This was the region of Timar. So there are two identifications. There are the travelling companies of Dedanim, the descendants of Abraham and Cush, and the descendants of Timar, who dwelt in this region here. So Isaiah 21 is talking about the Arab peoples who dwell in that region today. Why can I say it's about today? Well, I've just told you why we can say that. Because it's quite plain that Isaiah 21 is a prophecy of the latter days. Babylon is fallen, is fallen. That's going to be fulfilled in these times. Watchmen, what of the night? Look at verse 12. The watchman said, the morning cometh. What morning? This is the morning of a new day. Christ is coming. And so you see, we know we're in the context of the latter days in this prophecy. This is not something that's been fulfilled in the past. It is yet to be fulfilled, and it's not that far away. So what does he say? Verse 14, the inhabitants of the land of Timar brought water to him that was thirsty. This is a very dry and arid region. They prevented with their bread him that fled. Now the Revised Version says for that word prevented, it says they did meet the fugitives with their bread. So here it is, the Revised Version. So they went out to meet them. So the peoples who live in this area, Arab peoples today, they are going to go out to meet certain fugitives with their bread. Now, which fugitives do you think he might be talking about here? Well, verse 15 tells us. Verse 15 says, for they fled, that is these fugitives, they fled from the swords, from the drawn sword, and from the bent bow, and from the grievousness of war. This is a reference to Armageddon. It is a reference to the Gogian invasion of the land, which results, of course, in Armageddon. Gog is triumphant until Christ arrives on the scene. And in the weeks before Armageddon, as Gog endeavours to crush the children of Israel in the land, it's in that period that the Jews will be forced to flee. To survive, they will have to flee. 2/3 of the Jews in the land, and there are 5.5 million of them today, will perish in the events that we're talking about. The Gogian invasion, the great earthquake, etc. 2/3 of them. That's what? Nearly 4 million people? Nearly 4 million Jews will perish as a result of these events. Some of them will flee. They will flee to the east and to the south. And guess who will be there to meet them? Nomadic Arab peoples, the peoples who live in that region today, who will have been prepared by Christ and the saints to receive their Jewish brethren. What do you reckon would happen to Jews who fled into that region even today? What do you reckon would happen? You reckon that the Arabs would come out and say, here, our brother, here are some food and some water. You reckon that will happen? No. It's going to require the intervention of Christ and the saints to prepare these people to receive their Jewish brethren. But because they do, they're going to receive a reward. Because it says in verse 13, "In the forest in Arabia shall ye lodge, O ye travelling companies of Dedanim." Anyone ever seen a forest in Arabia? No one? There's golf courses there, isn't there? At Riyadh and other places, there's golf courses, but no forests. Why can't they grow forests in Arabia? Not enough rain, not enough water. I mean, sand will sustain a forest. I can take you to Fraser Island in Australia. I can show you rainforest. I can show you massive eucalypts on the largest sand island in the world. You know why trees and rainforest grows on Fraser Island? It's all sand. It grows because there's a lot of water. Fraser Island is full of freshwater lakes. In fact, the water is so abundant that when you're driving along the beach, which you do for 100 miles along that island, as you're driving along the beach, you're going through water all the time. It's not salt water. It's water coming out from under the sand hills, from the water table. That's what sustains the forest. So Arabia today is just a sandy desert. But when Yahweh's word is fulfilled and there are streams in the desert and he changes the climate of this region so that it rains regularly, this place will blossom as the rose. There will be forests, beautiful verdure. This place will be full of life, teeming with not only greenery, but full of animal life and bird life as well. It'll become a beautiful place. And it will become the dwelling place in the kingdom age for these Arab peoples who extended their hand to their Jewish brethren. Arabia will be transformed and they will receive the benefit of that. In the forest, which means to thicken with verdure, in Arabia must ye lodge. That is their reward, young people, for blessing Abraham's natural seed. I will bless them that bless thee. I will curse them that curse thee. So these people will receive a blessing. That's why Christ has got to go in there to deal with them before he arrives at the Mount of Olives. Okay? Happy with that? Of course you are. You're all nodding, I can see that. Just turn back a page in your Bibles, Isaiah 19. Because in Isaiah 19 we come to the subject matter of the smiting and healing of Egypt. I want to break this chapter up for you, and this is not a bad idea. I don't know that you're going to get all these things down, but it's not a bad idea to break this chapter up into its segments. In Isaiah 19, verse 1 is like the final picture, in a sense, up front. This is the way God delivers his prophecies, particularly in the Apocalypse, but throughout the Scripture. He gives you a final picture up front in brief terms, and then he tells you how that is achieved. So Isaiah 19 begins with the words, "The burden or the oracle on Egypt. Behold, Yahweh rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall not be moved," as it says in the Authorized Version. The word moved there means to be removed. So he's going to remove the idols of Egypt. He's going to get rid of the idols of Egypt. So they shall be removed at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. In other words, Egypt is going to be brought to its knees so that it can be rebuilt along divine lines. And that's what the chapter is about. So verse 1, Yahweh invades Egypt. Verses 2 to 4 tell us how that Egypt will spend some time under the cruel rule of Gog. That's the subject matter of those verses. Just have a look at verse 4. "The Egyptians will I give over into the hand of a cruel lord, and a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts." Verses 5 to 10 speak of Egypt's dire poverty at this time, and the utter confusion of their leadership is spoken of in verses 11 to 15. So Egypt, which is led by, of course, dubious rulers today, is going to in this period demonstrate the utter folly of its leaders. In verses 16 and 17, Egypt will be humbled. And that humbling is because, as you can see there, verse 16, in that day shall Egypt be like unto women, and it shall be afraid and fear because of the shaking of the hand of Yahweh of hosts, which he shaketh over it. So there's going to be a humbling of the Egyptians by the power of God. In verse 18, Egypt will be converted. See what it says there in verse 18? In that day shall 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the language of Canaan. Now what's the language of Canaan, do you think? Anyone know what the language of Canaan is? Well, it's Hebrew, isn't it? The land of Canaan was given to Israel. The language of Canaan is Hebrew. And Hebrew is God's language. So that we read in Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 9 that God will turn unto the peoples a pure language, his language. Now, it's not just talking about people having to learn Hebrew. Not modern Hebrew, by the way. Modern Hebrew is an advancement of biblical Hebrew. This is talking about introducing biblical Hebrew, so that the whole world, by the end of the millennium, will speak the same language. And the reason for that is because the languages of the world were confused by the rebellion of Nimrod. And God is going to reverse the work of Nimrod. So he'll give the people back a pure language. Now the reason that he does that is that it is said by those who know languages that Hebrew is by far and away the best language to express spiritual ideas. Now why wouldn't that be the case? It is, after all, God's own language. So therefore, there will be a conversion of Egypt. They will be given the language of Canaan. Now this is not just talking about talking Hebrew. It's talking about people coming to a knowledge of the truth. That's what it means in Zephaniah 3 verse 9. I will turn to the peoples a pure language. It's talking about changing their understanding, giving them an understanding of divine things so that they speak pure language when they speak of the things that pertain to God and his truth. And it says they will swear to Yahweh, verse 18. And one of those cities shall be called the city of destruction or demolition. That is, the destruction of the idolatry of verse 1. In verses 19 to 20, Yahweh is memorialized in Egypt. An altar is built in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar, it says, at the border thereof to Yahweh. Now this is going to take some years. It's not going to happen overnight. This chapter is talking about the smiting and healing of Egypt. It will take 40 years to achieve the final result. But it's a work that will go on throughout the period that the nations are being judged. The conversion of Egypt is spoken of in verses 21 and 22. And we see in verse 22 these words, Yahweh shall smite Egypt, he shall smite and heal it, and they shall return even to Yahweh, and he shall be entreated of them and shall heal them. So he needs to smite them, but then he starts the process of healing them. And finally we read in verse 23, in that day there shall be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptian shall serve with the Assyrians. And verses 24 and 25 speak of the time when Egypt will submit to Israel as the first dominion. That's going to be a remarkable time, isn't it? You imagine the Egyptians today submitting to Israel as the first dominion. They're at peace with Israel, but they wouldn't submit like this. So it says in verse 24, in that day shall Israel be the third, that is an intermediary between Egypt and Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the earth, as that word should be rendered, in the midst of the earth, whom Yahweh of hosts shall bless, saying, blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, mine inheritance. What a transformation that is. You imagine God saying that of Egyptians and Assyrians? Egypt, my people, just like he says of Israel. and Assyria, the work of my hands. Paul says we are the work of God's hands. We are his workmanship. This is telling us that these people, these nations, will then share what God has given to us, a knowledge of the truth. We have become his people, the work of his hands, and they will become his people and the work of his hands. And Israel will be in the middle of them, mine inheritance. That's a remarkable change, isn't it? It will come about over 40 years, young people, through the work of Christ and the saints. If you had to nominate someone to leave behind in Egypt while you went on to Jerusalem, if you were Christ, who would you nominate, you reckon? From amongst the immortalised saints. Who do you reckon's got the best knowledge about Egypt and how to deal with them and how to lead them? Joseph. We'll have to wait and see, won't we? But I wouldn't be at all surprised if Joseph ends up with the job of beginning the process of healing this nation. And so that's why Christ goes in there. Israel's going to have to come through here, and when Israel comes through under Elijah, some 40 years after he begins this process of smiting and healing them, Egypt will welcome them with open arms. There will be a highway to the land of Israel. And when it says here, Egypt and Assyria, in the time when Isaiah wrote, that was basically the extent of the then known world. To the north there was Assyria, to the south there was Egypt. So really this is not just about the countries who are close to the land of Israel. This is God's way of saying that what he will do with Egypt and with Assyria, he's going to do with the rest of the world. It's a prophecy about the abolition of human governments, when all the peoples of the world will come under the rule of our Lord Jesus Christ. And everyone will share the truth. There won't be a single person upon the face of the earth who's not a Christadelphian. Won't that be an amazing time? Today we are a minority, a dwindling minority, I might say. But tomorrow, no one, not one single soul, when these things have come to pass, will be anything other than a Christadelphian. That's going to be a remarkable time. And that's what that prophecy of Isaiah 19 is essentially about. Okay? Right, well we can move on from there. I just want to give you an idea now of how we synchronise all these things that we've been talking about. It's important that you have some kind of order in your mind. That's why we gave you that Bible insert. It will help you to get the order right. Firstly, Russia drives south along the coastal plains of Israel and overwhelms Egypt. That's what precipitates these events. That's what precipitates Christ's movement, firstly amongst the Arab peoples. But of course, it also precipitates the movement of other nations. The Tarshish nations will respond to the Gogian invasion of the land of Israel and of Egypt by entrenching their forces around Jerusalem. They will have to come in from the east because their ships will be destroyed in the Mediterranean by the Gogian Confederacy. Thirdly, Christ and the saints respond by moving from Sinai to subdue the Arabs. We've seen the reason for that. 4. Russia advances on Jerusalem, troubled by tidings from the east and the north, we are told in Daniel chapter 11. What do you think the tidings from the east might be? Anyone? What's happening to the east of Egypt, where Russia will have its main force? What's happening while Russia is there as a cruel lord? What's happening to the east? This. Christ and the saints are dealing with the Arabs. There'll be reports about that. What about the tidings from the north? What do you reckon the tidings from the north are? This here. The Tarshish powers, Britain, Australia, Canada, maybe America, New Zealand, South Africa, India, will have entrenched their forces around Jerusalem. That's tidings from the north. So Russia and Egypt hears these tidings, this news that comes from the east. What's going on out there? They don't know. But they hear news from the north, from Jerusalem. And they know that the Tarshish powers have entrenched their forces in and around Jerusalem in response to their invasion of Egypt. So they come back with their main force. They advance on Jerusalem, troubled by those tidings. Christ, meanwhile, goes in behind the departure of the main Russian body in Egypt. He smites Egypt, destroying the remaining occupying forces, and begins the process that we've read about in Isaiah chapter 19. 6. Russia is victorious over the Tarshish powers in Israel and sets up its headquarters between the seas, says Daniel 11, in my glorious holy mountain, saith Yahweh. It's about time for Christ and the saints to arrive on the scene. Meanwhile, of course, the Jews in the land are defeated, scattered, and taken into captivity, says Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 2. So Christ and the saints arrive at that vital moment just before the last Jewish resistance is crushed by the Gogian invasion. They arrive to destroy the Gogian power upon the mountains of Israel. And 9, the throne of David is immediately established in Jerusalem. And the Messiah is revealed to the surviving Jews. And the scene is described for us in Zechariah chapter 12, where the Jews will mourn in houses apart because of what they did and what their fathers did to their own Messiah so long ago. 10, there will be a proclamation to the nations to submit to Christ's rule. That proclamation goes on for 10 years, calling upon the nations to submit. Some nations will, some nations won't. So, I'm going to drop that out. I'm going to go to this chart. We've seen this before, haven't we? Return of Christ over there on the left-hand side, the establishment of Christ's universal rule over on the right-hand side, period of 50 years called the Jubilee period. 10 years into that, after the return of Christ to raise the dead, is Armageddon. The 40-year period of divine judgment. This is how it unfolds. We've seen it all before. Judgment seat of Christ, the marriage of the Lamb, revealing Yahweh Sabaoth, largely unseen by the world. The work of Elijah beginning before Armageddon, because you see, he gives them a warning that they're going to see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. That is Armageddon. Then the second Exodus begins and goes on for 40 years. The subduing of the Arabs, the smiting and healing of Egypt, both events which occur before Armageddon. Armageddon then sees the saving of the remnant of Judah and their being settled in the land over the next 40 years. Gog will be buried shortly after Armageddon, and the land will be cleansed and divided. The mid-heaven proclamation that we spoke about goes on for 10 years after Armageddon. Rome is then destroyed 10 years after Armageddon. Catholic Europe is destroyed in the next 30 years because they will resist the rule of Christ. Meanwhile, other nations will have submitted shortly after Armageddon, and they will help in the building of the temple. After the destruction of Rome, there will be the marriage supper of the Lamb, rejoicing at the destruction of the city that is the harlot city, the one who claims to be the bride of Christ. Christ will show the world his true bride. Finally, towards the end of this 40-year period of divine judgment, all nations will submit to Christ. And we've seen all that before. So now we can move on to the work of Elijah. And you're just going to have to give me half a second here because I have to get out of this one and get into this one. You'll remember this chart, young people. How that Christ will return, raise the dead, take them to Sinai for judgment. How that when he has immortalized the saints and prepared them for their work, Elijah will be sent out just before Armageddon to the Jews who are outside the land, that he might tell them that they're going to see this sign which will indicate that their Messiah is in the earth. Now we've got about 5 minutes. I want to take you to Malachi chapter 4, and we'll begin the study on Elijah. Malachi chapter 4. There's been some discussion in the past about the timing of Elijah's mission. Brother Thomas does seem to say that Elijah goes out after Armageddon, across the face of the day of 40 years. I want to talk about that. I just want to establish quite plainly when Elijah begins his work. Malachi chapter 4 verses 5 and 6 refer to his work. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Yahweh. So straight away we can see that you've got to deal with this word before. That word before is the Hebrew word pani, means the face, or standing in the face, or before someone. It is used in places like Malachi 3 verse 1 and Amos 1 verse 1. You step back to chapter 3 verse 1, it says, Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. That's the word. And the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant, etc. In Amos 1 verse 1, Amos prophesied 2 years before Pani, the earthquake. So its common use is about something that starts before something else, or someone who goes out before someone else appears. And that's the way we should understand it here. And we know that's true because, as you'll see in a moment, it can be shown by comparison with the New Testament that is what it means. I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Yahweh. Now, this day of Yahweh is not one day, it's a period of 40 years. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. Now this passage, verse 6, or portion thereof, is quoted in the New Testament. I want you to come to Luke chapter 1. Luke 1 and verse 17. Now Luke 1 is about the birth of John the Baptist, at least the promise of the birth of John the Baptist. It says in verse 14 of Luke chapter 1, Thou shalt have joy and gladness, the angel says to Zacharias, and many shall rejoice at his birth. For he shall be great in the sight of the Lord, and shall drink neither wine nor strong drink, and he shall be filled with the Holy Spirit, or a spirit of holiness from his mother's womb. This is about John the Baptist, a promise is being given. Then it says in verse 16, And many of the children of Israel shall he turn to the Lord their God. So when did John begin his work? Before Christ or after Christ? Obvious, isn't it? Of course he came before Christ, 3.5 years, in fact. That's why he said it's important. Verse 17 says, He shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah. And the quotation comes from Malachi 4 verse 6. To turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, there it is, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, and to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Brother Thomas translates that, by the way, to restore to the posterity the fathers' dispositions and disobedient ones to just persons' mode of thinking. Do you know that in Isaiah 29 it says that Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, if they knew what their progeny were doing, which of course they don't because they're dead, but if they knew what their progeny, natural Israel, were doing, they would be utterly ashamed of them. They would disown them because their children are nothing like them. So the work of Elijah will be to give back to the Jews their fathers, that is Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, their fathers' dispositions and their fathers' way of thinking. That's the work of Elijah. And so when he goes out, he's going to take 40 years to achieve that. And that work is the work of the second Exodus. So this citation in Luke 1 is very important. Malachi's message in Malachi 4 was to all Israel. John the Baptist fulfilled that prophecy when he came to Judah. That's why Jesus said, Matthew 11 verse 14, Matthew 17, 10 to 13. Jesus said, I know you won't understand this. This is what he said. You'll have difficulty understanding this. But if you could only see that John the Baptist was Elijah. Elijah has already come to you, Judah, whose commonwealth is about to disappear. But they couldn't understand it. And there's some who don't understand it today. John the Baptist was Elijah to Judah. All that remains is for Elijah to appear to scattered Israel. He has to have a work with all Israel. John fulfilled the first part of it to Judah. Elijah will be the one who goes to scattered Jewry. He doesn't have a work with the Jews in the land, as some think. His work is with the Jews outside the land. And so, young people, we'll talk more, God willing, tomorrow about that work of Elijah and the second exodus of Israel.